Hi guys. So today I decided that it wouldn't make sense for me to cram Unit 2 into a really, really, really large video. I decided that would be kind of stressful and probably confusing. So what I did was I decided to break it out into legislative, executive, judicial, and then the bureaucracy. Civil liberties will be all one video, but for this it just doesn't make sense for me to cram all that information at you. And I thought I'd take the one at a time approach. So the legislative branch was established by Article 1 of the Constitution. All right. So, in this article, we get all of their powers and the requirements to be a senator or to be someone who is in the House of Representatives. So, to be a rep, you have to be at least 25 years of age and you have to have been a citizen for 7 years. And then, if you want to be a senator, you have to be at least 30 years of age and then have been a citizen for at least 9 years. So we're gonna take a even deeper look at the inherent differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So in total, in the House of Representatives, there's 435 members, and they have a really, really influential rules committee that determines how, if, and when a bill will be debated on the floor, and will it be debated as a committee of the whole or just as the House of Representatives and what whoever's there in terms of quorum. Um, and so it's important to note that the House of Representatives is apportioned by population. So between censuses, your state might have different numbers of House of Representatives allotted to you. And it's the lower chamber of commerce, but their proceedings, because they have so much more people, is so much more formal than in the Senate. They are often more concerned about their constituents and what their constituents want because they're up for election every 2 years. So we're going to get into the Senate now. So, in general, the Senate is the upper chamber of Congress, and each state is given two representatives to satisfy that idea back in the New Jersey plan that the small states wanted. This is the upper house, and they're much less formal with their proceedings, and they are famous for stalling. It's something called a filibuster, where basically a guy who doesn't want unanimous consent to be reached, which is where everyone agrees to have the vote, decides to stall and just keep talking so that every other senator just kind of gives up and goes home. And so that's why our government's kind of infamous for not getting things done. It's just because the Senate is famous for stalling, but we can end that stalling by something called a cloture vote, which is a 60 vote thing by the other members of the Senate to end the filibuster and go to a vote. So, in that way, you're kind of achieving unanimous consent, but not really. But it's kind of the only way that things get done there. So, as I said, there's 100 members and they serve 6 year terms. So, a third of them are up for election every 2 years. But because they have 6 year terms, they're not as connected to their constituents. They're not as concerned. They're still going to listen to their constituents because they want to get reelected, but not so much as those of the House of Representatives. And so I think the important thing to mention here is something called the Speaker of the House. So when we think of Speaker of the House right now, we might think of Nancy Pelosi. And so that's the presiding officer of the House of Representatives and the quote unquote de facto leader of the majority party. So by default, she's kind of the leader of whoever is in the who's in the majority at the time of the House of Representatives. So that would be the Democrats then. But one thing you should note about the Speaker of the House, and we'll get into this a little bit later, they're influential in the sense that when bills come in, they're the people who are responsible for assigning those bills to a committee. And depending on where that bill gets sent to, might increase or decrease its chances of getting to the floor. We also have the President of the Senate, which is basically the Vice President. And they just they preside over the Senate's daily proceedings, and also if there's a tie, they would cast the tiebreaker. Now, one interesting thing that we should get into here is the 17th Amendment. So, when the Senate was originally created, it was supposed to be so elitist that state legislatures would be appointing the senators. However, the 17th Amendment was what changed Article 1 of the Constitution so that senators would be now elected by their constituents rather than appointed. Oh, and of course I keep using this fancy word. I expect that you guys probably know what that is by now, but if not, it's basically just all of the voters, all of the people that your senator or rep is representing. And we talked a little bit about in the Senate, because they're less concerned about their constituents, they often form bipartisan coalitions. So, a coalition is an alliance among political groups to achieve a common goal. And so, it's kind of that whole idea of factions again. There can be a lot of interest groups, there can be a lot of coalitions, they're all vying for a certain goal. So, one thing that I think gets a little bit, well, actually really confusing, and this just heavily simplifies it, is how a bill would become a law. Because it's a little bit different in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So, in the House of Representatives, let's just start there and look at it as though we are just starting here, and then we'll do the same thing with the Senate. So, my cursor's bothering me. I'm getting OCD. But basically, for a bill to be born, someone has to introduce it to the House of Representatives. So this will often be a representative. Technically, anyone can make a bill, but it's most usually someone who's actually in government. And so then when the bill is introduced, it will be sent to the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House will review the bill and decide where the bill is supposed to go, which committee. And from there, it'll go to the committee. The committee can either decide to table the bill and not do anything with it, or they can send it to the floor. The Rules Committee then will decide how this bill will be debated, if it will be debated, and can set time limits, can set voting arrangements in terms of the committee of the whole. And so, yeah, so then, depending on how the proceedings are supposed to go, the bill will be voted on the floor of the House, and then it will get sent to the Senate. So now we're just gonna kind of take a leap back and pretend that we're starting in the Senate, okay? So we're gonna start this process all over in the Senate. So, say a senator introduces a bill, right? Then it goes to the relevant committee, okay? And then it's going to, if it's approved by the committee, it's going to go to the floor. And that might sound a little bit easier than the House of Representatives, but it's not, because the Senate often, well, almost all the time, is famous for its filibusters. And as I said before, it's where a guy just kind of, or a gal, just keeps talking to irritate everyone, and they all go home because they know they can't come to a consensus with this guy who's rambling on nonsense. And so oftentimes it takes a lot of time for a bill to get through the Senate, and its chances are not as likely as they would be in the House. But let's go back to our House example. Once the bill passes the House, it goes to the Senate, and once a bill passes the Senate, it goes to the House. So all of those proceedings that I described in the House of Representatives and Senate would not change. So if they get passed by both houses, then it's going to go to the president's desk. The president can sign it, or Congress, or like if he doesn't sign it, he can veto it, but Congress can override him with a 2/3 vote in both chambers. And if either of those things occur, then the bill will become a law. If not, and the veto goes through, which often happens, or he does a pocket veto between sessions of Congress, then bill's not gonna become a law. And so this next thing here I think is important to go over. It gets a little bit cut off, but I'm just gonna go through it a little bit. It compares and well, mostly contrasts what the House of Representatives and the Senate do. So, one thing that's really unique to both of these guys is impeachment proceedings. So, impeachment trials, all, well, not trials, im- like your formal indictment to start the impeachment will begin in the House of Representatives. But the impeachment trial then has to go to the Senate. And then your justices will preside over this, and you have your Senate. But none of this conviction, none of it will occur in the House of Representatives. So these 2 points of impeachment are very unique to both of them, and it's very important to remember that. Another thing that you must remember about the House is that that's where tax and revenue bills must start through the Ways and Means Committee. Additionally, it's very hierarchical because you have the Speaker of the House that's assigning bills to committees. It's heavily influenced by the majority party then. But things get done faster because of this organization and the time limits that the Rules Committee sets. And so, as we can see, there is a powerful Rules Committee that decides how the bills will be debated and can summon the Committee of the Whole. And so we're going to go to the Senate real quick now. We talked about impeachment a little bit, but they are more known for their foreign relations, as to the House of Representatives is more known for their tax bills. The Senate, it must ratify treaties with a 2/3 supermajority, and so they have more influence on foreign relations, but things take so much longer on the Senate floor, and you need those 60 votes for a cloture to get people to stop filibustering. They're also notable for confirming presidential appointments, and this is something that the House of Representatives cannot do. And also, you technically need unanimous consent to end any debate to get to the voting. So a lot of times, so say this happens. This like never happens, but say a bill's introduced, everyone on the Senate there has unanimous consent, and they just want to vote for it. It'll go to a vote. That never happens. So you usually need cloture to get that quote unquote unanimous consent that's needed to vote. So, as we mentioned, we talked about the House Rules Committee. They're very powerful. We also talked about the Committee of the Whole, which is actually a House committee, and it's unique to the House, in which all the representatives serve in order to consider the details of a proposed law. So they can be summoned then by the House Rules of Committee. And now, also, say you have a bill in committee, and someone in the House of Representatives wants to bring it out of committee because it's taking too long and the bill's really important to them. They can have basically a bunch of people sign a petition to get the bill out. And a lot of times this is done by the majority party because it's so much easier to get a majority. We talked a little bit about unanimous consent, and we contrasted it a little bit with cloture. Now, one thing I want to mention about cloture is that specifically for appointments, now this says presidential appointments. We also changed this to judicial as well. Cloture requires just 51 senators. So it's making it a little bit easier for appointments to get through. And you can kind of reflect on, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Like personally, I have my own opinions on that. Now, let's look here at what a hold is, because we kind of talked about this. Holds happen when someone just keeps filibustering, when either one or more senators just doesn't want unanimous consent, doesn't want to vote, wants to keep debating. And so then you get something called a hold with all of these guys. And yeah, John, that's a really good way to describe it. It's very annoying. Um, all right, so now we're going to get into earmarks and pork barrel legislation. And here's where things in the Senate and the House of Representatives get a little corrupt. In general, earmarks aren't bad per se. They take some available discretionary spending that I personally believe should be used for better things, but They use it for specific local projects to bolster their constituent base, and these local projects may be a good thing, you might need that new bridge or something, but some of them are bad. Some of them are considered government waste. And as you can see, that's where government money is being needlessly spent. And so, a bad type of earmark would be something called pork barrel legislation. So, think of it as pork. You're just kind of beefing something up. Oh, I hate that pun. You're just kind I can't explain it any other way. You're just kind of beefing up your legislation so that those in your legislators those in that district, they're like, "Yeah, we like your legislation because it benefits us." So, it kind of just stacks projects and brings money into that district, and it boosts that legislator's chances of reelection. But as I talked about, this is considered government waste because it's a bad kind of earmark. Now, something that gets mixed up a lot, and I even mixed this up before I really delved into it, was pork barrel legislation as compared to log rolling. Now, log rolling, I have a really weird way of thinking this. I think of like a giant log, and there's like two people, and they're rolling it back and forth to each other. And all the while it's on the ground, it keeps picking up dirt and gross things because this practice is corrupt. And that's how I remember it a little bit. So basically, it's where two legislators are trading votes with each other for mutual benefit. So, say you have, I don't know, say you have legislator Rory. Actually, we'll make her more fancy. Senator Rory. And then we have, I don't know, Senator, I don't know, give me a name. I don't know, Senator Brandon Goramoro. Okay. And Senator Goramoro wants, I don't know, he wants more military protection for his district. So he wants to bolster developing his nuclear weapons. He has a little base which is probably illegal, but it's okay because that makes him happy and it makes the people in his district happy because, well, they like that form of energy. But then Miss Cantwell is sitting there and she has this issue in her district where people are angry about how crappy the roads are. And so she wants some money to fund improvements on the road so people stop complaining and blaming her for it. So, behind everyone's back, they decide, all right, we'll support each other's bills. If Rory, you vote for my bill, and if Gormore, you vote for my bill. And so they trade votes essentially in order to get both of their legislation through. So it's kind of messed up, but and typically you wouldn't be trading nuclear weapons for road votes, but that's all I could think of in the moment. So we're gonna now look at non legislative powers of Congress because all of this has to do with legislation. Look at all this. This is how bills get through, but we didn't talk about anything else except we kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier in some other videos of what else they do because they're not just making bills, they do other stuff. And these are called the non legislative powers because they're not making legislation. Ta-da. So these include the impeachment power, of which is partially reserved to the House, partially reserved to the Senate, the confirmation power of the Senate to approve presidential appointments, the investigative power to check out sneaky, sketchy things that are going on with Russia. Congress investigates a lot of stuff. Okay, so now we're going to look at the infamously famous. Actually, that's really an oxymoron. I can't believe I just said that. The infamous federal budget. There we go. And so, if you want to check it out, there's something called. Actually, you know what? Let me find this. I don't remember the exact. The World Deficit Clock. All right. There it is. There it is. The U.S. National Debt Clock. And Every second it's constantly updating. So this is the US national debt. It just keeps going up. And then you can look at all these other numbers and it'll just make you feel more and more depressed. And you want to know why you'll feel more depressed? That's because if you look at mandatory spending here and discretionary spending, you're going to see a trend where mandatory spending keeps going up and discretionary spending keeps running out of money for its funding. So, mandatory spending is something that includes net interest on the national debt as well as entitlement programs. And entitlement programs include things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And these things are offered to people who meet certain criteria. So that funding has been guaranteed to them because they've been paying into it for a very long time. Um, However, one interesting trend that we'll see with mandatory spending is that at the very beginning of our government, it was only about actually, alright, if I remember the dates correctly, around 1962, like, a while back, it was only a third of our budget, but now it's in about 2017, I think it was about two-thirds, and now it climbed to about 67%, I believe. And then discretionary spending is those optional payments that technically aren't required, but if you want to have agencies and funding for those agencies and you want to please basically the people, then you need to spend on other programs besides probably what you would have preferred. And so discretionary spending, you might be surprised, actually also includes the military. We're not obliged to spend money on the military, but we do because we have to provide for the common defense. So, this all occurs in the Appropriations Committee where they decide how this discretionary spending will be laid out after the national debt, mandatory spending are taken into account, as well as some other things. You can hear my dog in the background. I feel like this is just going to be a trend in my videos. There's no escaping it. But one interesting trend we've seen with discretionary spending is about 1962 again. Thank you, Salcon. But at about 1962, two-thirds were two-thirds of the budget were being used for discretionary spending, and then moving closer to current times, that dropped to under a third. And that's because there isn't as much money for discretionary spending after mandatory spending is taken into account. So hopefully that makes sense for you. And I would remember those trends because they're kind of important. And as I talked about entitlement programs, so that would be Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, I think a lot of you know what Social Security is, but Medicare and Medicaid sometimes get mixed up. Medicare is for the elderly and the disabled, and then Medicaid is for it's just medical benefits for low income workers. So, like, say you have a low income worker and they can't pay their hospital bill. Well, you have Medicaid that would be supporting them. And this is another interesting thing that John mentioned. It's another form of a uh, mandatory spending program that would help uh, families with the inability to feed their children, essentially. And so I think that sums that up very well of the federal budget and the previous legislative powers of Congress. But now let's kind of get into the attitudes of our congressional members because they can behave in three main ways and they can also have partisan attitudes. So one thing that you should note is, and I know we talked about this a little bit different in class, but this method that I learned on Khan Academy, like, this made so much more sense to me, and it was easier to think about people in terms of these methods. I know they're, like, very general terms, but I think they'll make sense to you too. So a delegate is someone who always follows their constituents' voting preferences. So they might end up voting against their conscience, but they wanna get reelected, and this often happens with people in the House of Representatives because they have such a short window. They have a 2-year window before they're up for reelection. And then we have someone who acts as a trustee. So this often happens with senators who are especially going into their term. They have a lot of time before that 6-year period is up. So they might listen to their constituents, but they're still going to vote their conscience. And then we have someone who acts as a politico, and this is derived from politician essentially. This member of Congress would act as a delegate on issues they care about, but if they don't care as much on an issue, they're going to listen to their constituents and they're going to act as a delegate. So it's like a delegate trustee hybrid. So that makes the politico. Partisan, and you'll hear the word partisanship all the time, is this idea that you have a even it could just be a regular person. They are such a strong supporter of one political party that a lot of times, if you have divided government, it's very hard for legislation to get through because people are so divided on it because they're such strong supporters of one political party over the other. And now we're going to get into that lovely, lovely, lovely topic of gerrymandering. Now, I want to show you an image here. Just gonna show you this so you can get a better picture in your head. It was a political cartoon from a while back. And by a while back, I mean a very long time ago. So I want you to just look at this picture. This is how the idea of gerrymandering, that term came about because it came from Eldridge Gerry, who was overseeing the apportionment of the district. And people looked at it and they said, that looks like a salamander. Now, personally, I think it looks like a dragon, but if you see the salamander, then there you go. But Jerry plus salamander equals gerrymandering. And so that's how that all came about. So if that interests you, that's the history of that. I think I said Eldridge. I meant to say Elbridge. I think I'm thinking of like country music today. I mean, I just woke up, so, you know. All right, so we're gonna go back to this whole idea of gerrymandering. So that's the act of deliberately changing the border of electoral districts to favor one party over the other. And so this sometimes happens during redistricting, which is the process of readjusting the borders based on a new census. So there's population changes. There's no current way for the Supreme Court to regulate gerrymandering at all. There's been cases where it's been established that, well, there's nothing really that says, you know. So that's something that's still kind of being figured out. A lot of people recognize it as wrong, but currently people get away with it. Now, just now, I did mention redistricting, and that's just readjusting the borders, but that's after reapportionment. So, reapportionment is where it's decided where uh, each district should be represented in population after every census. So, you have to reassign that representation. And so, once you reassign that representation, then you can start redistricting and divvying it up. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. We're going to get into two court cases that, for some reason, I even mix up occasionally, and I think I got it down now. So we're going to go back to that year 1962 that I was talking about in terms of the federal budget, but I didn't even notice this was a 1962 case. But hey, that's always interesting. Basically, this man, his name was what am I? Transitions. I can't today. Basically, Tennessee was dividing the districts disproportionately, and that was making it so that voters were getting their vote diluted, and so they brought that case to the Supreme Court, and they decided that in the state of Tennessee, you can't dilute someone's vote. So if you can prove that someone's vote is being diluted, that's going to violate the Equal Protection Clause. And so they clearly violated the Equal Protection Clause because they did not redistrict for 60 years. So they never reapportioned the population and then they never redrew the boundaries. So the court created this one vote, one person, one vote principle. So that means that every person's vote should be equal. Now, You could obviously argue that with gerrymandering still going on, that but, in this case, the court was able to extend its jurisdiction to review state redistricting issues. So, you see this huge word judicial activism, and I like that John pointed that out. Judicial activism is when the courts get involved in something very relevant, something very pressing of the time. So you see this in desegregation of schools, and you kind of even see this in getting involved in this issue of people not being represented properly. Now we're going to see an instance of reverse discrimination in this case. So gerrymandering occurred in North Carolina to benefit African Americans because they were trying to account for racial imbalances in their state, but they did so by actually undercutting the votes of other people. And so this wasn't complying with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And people's votes weren't equal then. And so gerrymandering was determined that it cannot be based on race. Okay, so that set a huge precedent. All right, so I think it's important now that we get into this idea of divided government. So a lot of times you might hear the term divided government, you'd be like, oh, they're not going to get anything done. And a lot of times that happens, and you get this term called gridlock. But divided government is just simply when one party controls one or both houses of Congress and the other party is in power of the executive branch. And so a lot of times what's going to happen is the majority party in the Congress is going to want certain legislation. It's going to get to the president's desk. He's going to be of the opposite party. He's just going to veto it. Now, I think you could certainly have your own opinions on this because a lot of times this leads to gridlock, but because both groups are so self-interested, they're only going to come to compromises on the most important matters. So I think that's kind of important to note when we're talking about divided government. Now, gridlock is, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of government shutdowns when nothing gets done, but gridlock just happens when the government just they can't come to a compromise. They can't make a policy decision, and it makes the government slow. Things aren't getting done. And you're gonna see this lame duck session with the president too. This is just kind of the period between one Congress session and another. So, one Congress is just kind of chilling until the next already elected Congress kind of comes in. So, nothing really gets done here, and you'll see this in the presidency too. So, that took you the whole way through Article 1 of our Constitution. Okay, so in a separate video, I'm going to get into Article 2 so that you can start to understand the executive branch a little bit more. There's quite a bit more because we're going to be going through all of this, but I would just say stay tuned and stay patient. Um, I'm going to pull up my Quizlet real quick so that you can take a look of where I'm at with it. I took a break last night instead of like killing myself and staying up late because I wanted to be able to be efficient today. So, as you can see, these 121 terms are just a review of everything that I talked about in this video. And as always, they are set up in the same format. So they have things that are important to one section, and then they get right into the questions, they test your knowledge, and frankly, after this video, you can probably even skip the content and just test your knowledge on these questions embedded in here. So I wish you the best of luck, and if you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask. Me just failing to figure out how to end a video. There we go. See ya, guys.